These talks are called Looking Back, but they are not meant to be nostalgic. I do like looking back at the past, but I don't like nostalgia, because nostalgia is tremendously subjective and sentimental, and it has a very strong personal element. And all of those things lead to attachment, which I don't think is favorable to spiritual advancement. Now, these talks are a matter of accommodation. We usually can't have our talks in June and July, the summer school, because I'm something of a fanatic about gardening, and there are things that I have to do at those times, and we couldn't have a summer school then. And so that leaves usually the second half of July and August, if there's going to be a summer school at all. Then we have to take into account other things. There's a summer school at the headquarters in Oceanside, and we don't want to conflict with them. And then next week there is an international conference of the Rosicrucian Fellowship in Spain, and we don't want to conflict with that either. So in order to accommodate, we had to schedule for this week, the 14th through the 18th. The catch is that this week Mercury is retrograde, and that's something that terrifies some folks. It really shouldn't. Max Heindel states many places that all things work for the good. So having that thought in mind, I tried to work with the flow of the season in preparing these offerings. The morning talks are all about astrological retrogrades, and the evening talks are about looking backward, or backward movement in consciousness and in life as seen by the Rosicrucian philosophy. Now, I'm not sure that either series is going to be successful, especially these evening talks. I am protected, though, so that even if the talks don't come off right, I can blame it on Mercury retrograde. Mercury is the lord of alibis in the first place. The reason for the difficulty with the preparation of these talks is that they are conceived in a different format than I usually work with. Normally I take a unified monolithic theme and try to develop it. In this case, it's more like a patchwork of little vignettes in the Rosicrucian philosophy. Sophisticated people would call it a pastiche, but since I lack sophistication, it's much more like a hodgepodge. Now, most of us are of such an age that we have retired from our work life. And at this age, we do a lot of looking back, whether we're aware of it or not. And one of the forms of looking back is the reunion. And last summer, I went to the 60th reunion of my high school class. It was dismal. Not because of the character of people. They were all nice people. And even the ones that weren't always so nice back then, life had rubbed off some of the rough edges of them. The reason it was dismal is because so many of the people had retired from more than their work careers. They had retired from life itself. Most of them had nothing they were looking forward to. And they were just sort of waiting out their life and waiting for death, I guess. Now, I haven't kept continuity with most of the classmates, or with none of them, as a matter of fact. So it was difficult for me to benefit from watching the evolution of their consciousness as they grew throughout life. So I didn't have that. So with no future to talk about, and no long-term past history, the conversations very quickly broke down into, you remember when you did that so long ago? And when it gets to that, the conversation is dead. So there was nothing left to do but to head for the exit, which I did rather quickly. Now, from this and other experiences, we can see that there are various ways of looking back. Each of these ways of retrospecting has different effects. And the way we look at things, or even the way we remember, depends on our character. Now, I have known two people who have almost drowned. And they were so close to death that they saw their lives in reverse. And one was an electronics technician that I worked with for my entire career. And he was a very staid, conservative, and conventional kind of person. He wore clothes like you would expect electronics technicians would wear, but he had them ironed and things like that. To him, I was way too liberal. And he viewed me as sort of a wild and crazy man. He may have been right. You can't tell. But when I would begin speaking about spiritual things, he couldn't help but to listen and want to listen more. Because in the near drowning experience, he had stratified the soul ethers from the biological ethers in his vital body, and that made him a sensitive. And so he was sensitive to things that other people were not sensitive to because they were so grounded in the world. So, with his technical bent, when he described seeing the panorama when you leave your body, he described it as though he were watching a video, and that he could see every detail. His character, what he was, determined the way that he remembered. And even in such a thing as an uncontrolled memory like the past life panorama, even then, the way he saw it depended on his character. Now, the other person who almost drowned was Bobby Stevens from Detroit, who we all love, and we all love him because he loves so much. Now, several years ago at a conclave in Detroit, he described his experience of the panorama when he was a youth and his so-called buddies threw him in the water and he didn't know how to swim. And he went down, and I don't know how many times he went down. And he told his experience of the panorama. But when he told it, there was no mention of pictures. No mention of pictures at all. Instead, what he related were all of the feelings and emotions that he had in the past, and they all came back to him. And he felt them just as he had felt them before. Now, Bobby was a very feelingful man, and that was what and how he remembered. It also produced a stratification in the ethers in him, and he became a sensitive, but he became a sensitive that worked with his feelings, and he became a very loving man. Now, there seems to be a principle in this, and that it is what we are determines what and how we see things when we look back. In this, character is not static. It's not set. It's not determined once for all. Character is plastic. It changes slowly, and it is always becoming. And in that becoming, we have the privilege of becoming of whatever we want to be. What we do now is what we become. And that relates especially to how we look at the past. In recent years, as my body has become more aged, I have analyzed my own personality as much as I am capable of. Much more than ever before in life. Before in life, I was always jumping into things and racing off to do something new. Now, if you analyze your life, you can do it in various different ways. If you look at your character only as it is now, that's an all right thing to do. However, that kind of view lacks depth. And there is a kind of depth that only history can reveal. If you see someone in the moment as they are right now, you're seeing a finished product as far as it has come. What's missing is all the effort or lack of effort and all the trials and the triumphs and the failures and all of those things to bring you to be what you have become now. And if you can see that, you're seeing something very wonderful. You have a sense of process. You have a sense of personal evolution. But there's more to it than that. There is the then and now viewing of trying to manifest an idea or an ideal. The way we viewed an ideal when we were young is different from the way we do it now. If one wants to become a kinder and gentler person, if one persists, one will become kinder. But along the way, the view of what kindness is enriched and it becomes deeper. What I'm trying to get at is in all things, even if we're on the way to somewhere else, we are changing and we are becoming. And the Rosicrucian philosophy very wisely brings us to realize that we are participating in an evolutionary activity. Period. Evolution is always going on. It's something that's eternal. The more thoroughly we imbue ourselves with an evolutionary attitude, the more harmonious we can be with reality, because everything else is evolving also. And evolution is all about changing and adopting or creating new situations. It's a continuous becoming. And evolution is a very fancy way of saying getting better. So if we look back with an evolutionary attitude, we can see how we saw kindness before. and how we see kindness now. And that opens us to a realization of the fact that the future is open, and the things we aspire to can be something different than the, how would you say it, immature view that we have now. There is a promise that things are going to be better, that things are going to grow. So what I'm trying to say, I'm trying to get at this is part of that pastiche of principles. What I'm trying to say is that looking back opens up the future. It opens us up to a healthy looking forward. Sometimes, if we look at ourselves now as we are now, we are amazed at what we are. We say to ourselves, how did I come to this? Or how did this become in me? And then with all existential questions like this, if we persist in our asking and we deepen our asking and we listen, we get answers from within. This is an extremely helpful way of developing. Looking back is very important. The past is factual. Facts can be interpreted in many ways, but the past itself is factual. We saw how two different people looked at the facts of their past and how it changed their future. The factuality of the past in context of how we experience things now opens us up to a pair of co-principles. Two principles that are partnered with each other. One is that when looking back or when looking at the past, objectivity is a healthy attitude. If we are subjective about the past, we are denying reality. We are denying what really happened. Nostalgia is that kind of soapy, sentimental subjectivity about the past. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have feelings, because feelings are facts also. The past is not just a collection of cold, dry facts. It is filled with feeling. If we retrospect with feeling, or if we retrospect without feeling, we reap very little from our lives. Because to do that, we're like gray people with only black and white things. Now, the co-principle is that subjectivity is obviously the healthy attitude for the future. If we think that the future is going to be a certain way, and we plan that the future is going to be a certain way, it will be. But in that, we have limited the possibilities of new things that could have happened along the way. The future is something that we don't know. And to be subjective about it and not trying to say it's this and it's going to be this is very healthy. It takes a certain amount of faith. You have to be able to accept the fact that the future, it might not, your plans might not all come to be the way you want them to be. But if you have that faith, you're in a good shape. If we aren't subjective about the future, we leave little room for new things, for unexpected blessings, and for things that we couldn't even conceive being. If one says to oneself, I'm going to be this kind of a kind person, that doesn't leave any room for depth or motivation. We have to see the future as filled with unprecedented things. Not all of the effects of looking back are healthy if it is not done right. We have examples of that from scripture and story. Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt for looking back. She wanted to go back to the old ways. Orpheus lost his beloved Eurydice. He lost her to the underworld by looking back too soon. Objectivity, if it is true, is good, but not objectification. We have to differentiate between the two of them. Many psychiatrists and psychologists say they are objective, but that is just a way that's a cover for the fact that they don't have any compassion or empathy. Many men are guilty of objectifying the bodies of women. It is a matter of being self-aware of what and how and why we are doing or what we were doing. It is a matter of attitude. What kind of attitude do we have about the past? Are we glad that it's over? In doing that, we shield our little egos from re-experiencing experiences, so we don't want to look back. In doing so, we are neglecting the important fact that for our real being, our spiritual being, that is undamaged by any kinds of events in the past, pleasant or unpleasant. There may be injuries and distortions of our inner vehicles, but the spirit that lives through these vehicles, is eternal. So what I'm trying to say is that it behooves us to take faith in the Spirit and to fully face the past, so that we see it both as the electronics technician, where we see everything technically clear, or as Bobby saw it with all of the feelings. I've had some pretty horrendous feelings, but I'm willing to re-feel them. In fact, I spend quite a bit of time doing that now. If we accept everything and we treat everything as precious, we find a lot of treasures in our past experience that we never would have believed possible. Now, some people don't have horrendous memories that they try to escape from. Some people have what they call precious memories, and they try to preserve them as if they were rare and perishable treasures. They are precious, but they have to be opened for their value to be nourishing to our spiritual being. If we don't open and expose our treasured memories, it's similar to holding an egg and refusing to break it open even though you're starving. You know what I mean? This is soul food that your very inner being grows by. So the capacity to creatively enter the future is dependent on soul power. And that soul power can only be derived from the past. And while we're on that subject, it is not only the pleasant things that we hold precious. Sometimes we idolize and we preserve extremely unpleasant things. I have a very dear friend that has experienced all kinds of sorrows in life. And this friend was strong enough to endure them. And this friend grew through them. So that even those horrendous experiences were a reminder of the strength. But this friend clings to them and goes over them again and again and again, not to open them up and to be freed from them, but to be possessive of sorrow. It's a surprising thing, but you can be possessive of sorrow just as you can be of joy. Experiences have not only shaped the life and potentially the personality, they become part of the self-identity. And they become life itself. So that if we are holding an image, whether we hold it precious or whether we make it precious even though it was horrendous, we're spending a lot of energy keeping those moments to ourselves. And when you hold on to things like that, especially if you hold them in your subconscious memory, that results in the pushing down, we call pushing down depression. And the friend that is hanging on to the sorrows is extremely depressed. The whole life is depressed. Horrible experiences, as well as sublimely beautiful ones, do hold spiritual treasures. But they have to be broken open by looking back into them to draw the essence out of them. It's all right to lose the memory as long as you have the essence out of them, because you don't want to carry around all kinds of memories, that gets to be psychologically cumbersome. We can't take memories per se into the spirit any more than we can take physical possessions into the spiritual worlds. There's that old joke saying, you never see a U-Haul following a hearse. There's more. There's always more. These are a few examples of many, many possible attitudes that deter our progress in soul growth. And by not looking back, or not looking back effectively, we deter our spiritual progress. And it's up to us, no one's going to do it for us, to examine our attitudes and to determine what are the things that are pro-evolutionary and that move us along and that move us forward, and which things that we do are detrimental to our progress. Now, just a few minutes ago, we looked at what appeared to be healthy attitudes with regard to looking back at the past and looking forward to the future. And we said that a key attitude to looking back is objectivity. What happened, happened, and that can't be changed. And that immutability of the past is a backstop. And it keeps us from trying to regress backwards in some kind of wishing. The entire universe is focused on each atom of the universe. And in that there is an almost infinite amount of information that can be derived from even one small event. Some things are more important than others, so that is what we keep in mind. Now, we also said that the key attitude to looking forward is subjectivity. We really do not know what the future is going to be. We trust that our past causes will have just consequences. But when we confront those consequences, we will have evolved. We will have grown. We will have changed. And since the time we initiated those causes, and that means that the consequences will also have been evolved. And we might not recognize them, but we do not want to have the idea that the consequences are going to be exactly like the previous causes were, because what has happened in the intervening time has changed the causal mechanism. This means that even though we have things looming from the past, we can create for the future. We can look at things in a different way, and we can look for something new. And I think with relation to the future, there's one very short quote from Hamlet that says, "The readiness is the all." And that is really important to soul growth, because we might miss something like an initiatory experience if we aren't ready for anything. If we can't accept some challenge that comes to us out of the blue because it is new, we're not ready for initiation. Now, actually, objectivity and subjectivity with regard to looking back and looking forward are a result of a cosmological process within the life cycle, or the cycle of rebirth. So I want to take a simple example of something that we are all living through and of which we are more or less conscious, to get an idea in another way of how looking back works. When we came to rebirth, we began as little infants. At birth and shortly thereafter, the inner worlds were closed off to us. And at that point, we have only the future. Our entire life is before us. We are completely looking forward. Now, our parents lovingly coax us into this world, and they coax us into the future. And they help us develop what potentials we have in us, even the physiological things. Goals are used. We try to get goals are placed for us by our parents, and they rejoice in us when we take our first step or say our first word, and so on. I'm very fortunate in that I can remember taking my first step. And the reason I remember it is because there was such an enormous amount of positive feedback. It was like I was in a glow of positivity just for taking that first step. As we move forward, we become more autonomous, especially after the birth of the desire body at puberty. And then we set our own goals, and we determine more of our own future, even if we are habit-bound and aren't very creative about future. We look forward as little children to going to school, and as teenagers, we look forward to learning to drive, and eventually we look forward to leaving home. Now, correlative to looking forward, we change physically. And it wasn't just growing up and getting bigger. Our bodies became more mineral. They became harder. The skull of an infant is soft. It's not even closed after birth immediately. And the long bones are rubbery. As we progress in life and look forward, we become harder. We become more like the material world. We become more mineralized. Our bones become brittle. Our skin becomes crusty and cracky. And the changes are not only physical, there are social and eventually spiritual changes. Following our dreams, we become more engaged socially. We maybe joined the Scouts and did things with other kids. We made more friends, new friends, and eventually we had girlfriends or boyfriends. Not all of the social integration was made with full consciousness, and it wasn't direct. It just seemed to happen. If we learned to drive, we were integrated into the world in another way. We were subject to traffic laws. And later on, if we buy a house, we're subject to all kinds of things. In infancy and very early childhood, we had a marvelous memory. But it is different from the memory we now have. In childhood, it faded, and we'll never know that again except if we develop a higher kind of consciousness. At first, in our desire to plunge into the future, we didn't pay much attention to the past or to memory. But somewhere along the way, we start looking back. And that process accelerates. Usually, looking back begins with parenthood. We watch our children develop, and we realize that we don't remember much of our own childhood. And if we do, it is much different from the perspective that we have when we're looking back with adult values. We even begin to wonder whether or not we have children. We begin to look back and we don't remember much of our childhood, and we do it with a different kind of perspective. And as life goes on, looking back becomes more and more important to us. And it takes up a larger part of our consciousness. There's a significant push when grandchildren are born. There's another one at retirement, because we have to define ourselves relative to the world in a different way. And eventually it is like those people at my class reunion. There isn't much to look forward to except death. But there are tons of memories. And we start looking back and processing them more and more. So basically what we're talking about here is, in the course of life, there are two streams of activity. One begins at birth, and when we have no consciousness of the past, and we look forward. And looking forward draws us more and more into the world and into our bodies, and even changes our bodies. The other stream of consciousness in us, it's not clear when it begins. It's an indeterminate time. And we continuously look back. And we look back more and more. It isn't at the same rate that, like our looking forward slows down at the same time that our looking backward speeds up or becomes a more important part. It isn't that close of a causal relationship, but we have both of these activities. And the looking back has the effect of taking us more out of the world. And with that, it brings us more in touch with spiritual things. If you go to a church, the church is not filled with a lot of young people. The church has an unusually large population of oldsters. Somewhere in the middle of life, these two streams cross. I don't know if that is an important moment, if there's a deciding moment in that, but they do cross. And the forward-looking, incarnating activity definitely diminishes, and it slows down at the same time that the backward-looking, disincarnating activity increases. Again, there is a different attitude between forward-looking in youth and backward-looking in age. The youth is subjective. The future is such that a young person says, I can do anything. While at the same time, when a person obtains the objectivity of consciousness from looking back, the outlook changes. And an older person would say, why would I want to do that? Because the experience has brought home a realization that some things are mere folly. So it's not merely the range of memory that produces objectivity, though that does help to foster it. The objectivity is impersonal. And being impersonal, it is more likely universal. So we can see that a lot of ways that these two activities, the fact that older people are more spiritual and are more in touch with universal things, that comes with an understanding of things that are objective. As you can see the world from the outside in, it's altogether different if you're a young contender and you're looking from the inside out. And older people have been humbled, and they're even more open to humility. Physical limitation brings that about, as well as the universalization of consciousness. Now, these are very simple principles. There's something that we probably all experience all the time, but we can see that for their simplicity, they are very, very important. They're very big things. And if we look into them, we can find that there are a lot of practical applications. For instance, when you go to bed, it's not a smart thing to do to plan your day for tomorrow, because that's incarnating at the hour of the day when you should be disincarnating. People who don't process the past but are always looking forward are people who become somnambulists. Conversely, if we start looking back when we're starting some new forward-looking motion, some new activity produces hitches. And we can't move forward at the time that we need to move forward the most, when we need to charge forward, if we have hitches because we're thinking back on the past and failures and things like that. So these are things that have a lot of applications, more than I can give examples of. And that's about all I want to say for tonight. There's just a few simple little ideas that we know and that we can experience, and we can look at our lives with regard to them. And I'd like to close with a quote. It's a quote from a swashbuckle spiritual mystery novel by Talbot Mundy. I won't give all of the quote because the end of the quote is clunky, but this part is just beautiful. Love lives forever, now and forever. Pain and the past are its chrysalis, its seedbed, where necessary nothings rot to produce such real wonders as, there's that subjectivity for the future. Love lives forever, now and forever. Pain and the past are its chrysalis, its seedbed, where necessary nothings rot to produce such real wonders as... You can see I can't get away from the garden. I planted some seeds and I wanted to see how many of them came up. Let's close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. O God, increase our love for Thee, so that we may serve Thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in Thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Any questions? If you want to throw fruit, now's the time to throw fruit. Thank you very much.